Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. So this is Understanding PFAS in Water, Essential Knowledge for Manufacturing. And interest has been growing very quickly in the water space due to issues of contamination from PFAS. It's quite a complicated topic, and my aim today is to demystify this topic and get everyone up to speed so that they really understand what PFAS is all about. So the agenda today is to start with, well, what are PFAS exactly, to get a good understanding of what those are. A short chemistry lesson is very basic. It's to give you context to the problem and not to bamboozle your heads with chemistry whatsoever. Next, we'll look at regulatory approaches, both here and in the US, and that gives context to addressing the problem as well. And then we'll look at solutions, what we can do to treat PFAS in wastewater and deal with this problem. And at the end, I'll give you some concrete actions that you can take if you think PFAS might be an issue for your manufacturing facility. Okay, so what are PFAS? You may have heard the term forever chemicals, but what exactly does that mean and what are we dealing with? So first of all, the acronym PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So per and poly refer to completely or partially fluorinated, so fluoro, and alkyl is carbon chains. So they're organic compounds where fluorine is bound to the carbon, and they can be completely or partially fluorinated. So let's look at examples. So PFOA is the most commonly known PFAS compound. PFOA stands for perfluoro, so completely fluorinated, octanoic, 8 carbons in the chain, and acid refers to the head group there. So it's a completely fluorinated 8 carbon compound with acidic head group. Similarly, PFOS is a perfluoro, completely fluorinated, octanoic, 8 of those carbons. Sulfonate refers to the head group there. So these are the two most common and the two most regulated PFAS compounds. And that just shows you where that naming convention comes from. But let's take a step back and look at where do we find PFAS in everyday life. So there's lots of applications for these very useful compounds. So for example, they're used in firefighting foams. So they act as surfactants to the phrases make water wetter. So it shoots out and douses a fire quicker, and they have flame resistant properties as well. They're found in waterproof gear, so in hiking boots, in rain jackets. Gore-Tex is an example of a PFAS material. And they're also found in non-stick utensils and cookware. So a Teflon pan, which is non-stick, uses PFAS as well. So they're extremely useful compounds. Some more examples here. So PFAS are used as coatings in electronics. They're also the coatings in food packaging. So when you have a pizza box and you bring that home and the grease of the pizza stays neatly within the pizza box, that's the PFAS coating on it. And they're widely used in cosmetics as well. I'm pretty sure my mascara has PFAS in it because it goes on really nice and doesn't clump. So really desirable properties there for PFAS, lots of applications, lots of uses for them. And these are just a few of the examples. So the reason that we use them in so many applications are due to these unique properties that PFAS have. They're both water resistant, they're oil repellent, and they're very, very durable compounds. So these properties make the substances very desirable, but they're also the reason, the durability particularly, is the reason they're problematic. So let's look at PFAS in manufacturing. Now, this is data from a Belgian study, a market study looking at the 12 market segments that use PFAS in Belgium. We don't have the same data for Ireland, so the distribution might be quite different, but in terms of the high users of PFAS in market segments, these are the top ones for Belgium. So the top one there is medical devices, followed by textiles. So TULAC is textiles, upholstery, leather apparel, and carpets. And then there's heating and ventilation, paints and coatings, PPP are plant protection products or pesticides. And then there's plastics, paper and cardboard can be quite a big one depending on the size of the industry. Fire protection, which we saw earlier, semiconductors, as I said, they're coatings in electronics, and then cables and metal processing, so in the lubricants in the processing of metals. So there's quite a huge number, really, of uses for PFAS in manufacturing. So as I said, the distribution may be different for Ireland, but that's a good heads up of the types of manufacturing industries that use PFAS. So what exactly is the problem then with these compounds? So the durability is due to the strong carbon-fluorine bond. This is the unique property of PFAS. It's a very strong chemical bond, and therefore breaking that bond requires high energy inputs. Now, these are synthetic chemicals without natural breakdown pathways readily found in the environment. Okay, I should say there are breakdown pathways, but they're not common and they're not fast. So typically these compounds do not break down in the environment. And as a result, they will accumulate in soil, in water, and they are then mobile and can be transported distances. So they can quite quickly contaminate the environment. And if they're not breaking down in the environment, when we ingest them, they don't break down readily in us either. So when you're continuously consuming these compounds, they tend to bioaccumulate. And then the issue there is that PFAS has been linked to health implications. So they're linked to thyroid disease, cancer, liver damage, fertility issues. So they are toxic, and that is due to that bioaccumulation effect, and that is due to the strong carbon-fluorine bond, which doesn't break down very easily. So they're starting to become a problem. Okay, I promised you a short chemistry lesson, and I promised you it wouldn't be hard, and I didn't promise there would be a test either. So look, let's not worry about it. Just get into it. So PFAS, we've come across the acronym earlier, completely or partially fluorinated carbon chains, and we've met PFOA and PFOS. However, there are many, many types of PFAS. So I want to just get across the numbers and different types of structures. So these are 4 that have been noted by the US EPA for regulation, along with PFOA and PFOS. So this one here on the bottom is a Gen X compound. These were introduced to replace PFOA and PFOS. So this is called a dimer acid. It's got 2 halves centered around that oxygen. So these were introduced and then subsequently found to be toxic as well. So now they are targeted for regulation. So then getting back to our 8 carbon compounds. So when these break down, it tends to be sequentially into shorter chains. So PFOA and PFOS become 7 carbon, 6 carbon, 5 carbon, 4 carbon compounds. And the issue there is that with that reduction in carbon chain length, the compounds become increasingly volatile. Therefore, they can be airborne and mobile, and they can spread to other areas. So it is important when treating these and breaking them down that they are completely broken down into fluoride, carbon dioxide, water, salt. So continuing our exploration of the many types of chemistries of PFAS. So these are 2 more examples. So they're not just those particular carbon chains. This compound, only half the carbons are fluorinated. This is a common medication for dry eyes. And then this short branched one here is a cleaning agent for electronic devices or a diluting solvent for coatings and paints. So with the different structures, you'll get different applications and different types of PFAS. And then there are polymers. So these are very well-known polymers, PTFE and PVDF, and those are the repeating units that you can see there. And there's some debate about whether polymers should be classed in the same way as the discrete compounds that I've shown you. So these repeating units, they'll represent, it can be thousands of those repeating units in a polymer. So they're not quite the same as discrete compounds. And that's why there's a little bit of debate about whether they should really be classed with other PFAS compounds. But we'll come on to that in a little bit. Okay, so depending on how you define PFAS, there could be up to 14,000, I've heard 16,000 compounds of PFAS. And you can see here the variety of chemical structures, and just the huge number of different ways that these compounds can be put together. So we've really gone nuts in developing these compounds for their useful applications and properties. So it kind of gives you an idea of the complexity of the problem. We're talking about thousands of compounds that we've been making and now need to deal with. So let's look at the approaches that we're using to deal with the regulatory approaches. And given their diversity and their health implications, they do need to be regulated. So for here, I want to discuss the US approach first, because it is more defined and it is simpler than the EU approach, and it just gives you an idea of how to go about regulating these types of compounds. So the US are actually ahead of the EU in terms of getting to grips with this problem. So this is a map of contamination in the US. It's quite up to date. And they've identified sites where drinking water is above proposed limits, military sites where they've been using firefighting foams in training exercises. They've caused contamination. And then there's other known sites from industries. So they've been monitoring this problem and getting to grips with it for some time. And the US EPA have moved on regulation of PFAS in drinking water. So as of this year, the Biden administration announced MCLs, which are maximum contaminant levels of PFAS in drinking water. These are enforceable. So prior to this, the US EPA, pre-2016, they had health advisory levels of 600 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS combined. And then in 2016, they drastically reduced that down to 70 parts per trillion, realizing that there were health implications from these compounds. But that was still a health advisory level. So now with this maximum contaminant level, this is really strong indication from the EPA, the US EPA, that they're going to deal with these. And the limit of 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, it indicates that they don't think there's a safe level of these compounds in the environment. So with that, they've added Gen X chemicals and a couple of others. Those are limited to 10 parts per trillion. And then where there's mixtures of these named PFAS compounds, there's a hazard index calculation that can be done to determine the compliance there. There's 5 years to comply as of this year. So that was announced just this year in April 2024. And this actually represents very fast movement from the US EPA on regulating compounds. We haven't really seen that before. And it just gives you an indication of the urgency and the direction of travel of this issue. So let's look at Europe. So mainland Europe, they do have a certain amount of monitoring that has taken place. So this map is from a project called the Forever Pollution Project. And it was actually a journalistic investigation, a collaboration between Le Monde, Guardian, and other media partners across Europe. And what they've done is they've mapped PFAS producers, sites where contamination is known, so there's test results, and known PFAS users. And then they've gone in blue for presumptive contamination. So this is based on estimations where there's no testing or they couldn't confirm PFAS presence, and it's sort of based on, it's a presumption of contamination based on a scientific best guess, shall we say. The authors of this project themselves say their figures are likely to be greatly underestimated. And in particular, if we look at Ireland, that can be seen to be true. So from the Forever Pollution Project, what they've found in Ireland, or what they've mapped, is mainly presumptive contamination. There's one known contamination in Dublin from 2008. There's 2 known PFAS users mapped there. But actually, this project didn't pick up on some detections, and it does depend on when they collected the data. So we have had detections of PFOA, so from 10 to 45 parts per trillion detected in River Brosna, and that's subject to an investigation by Westmeath County Council in coordination with the Irish EPA. The Irish EPA funded research into landfill leachate and found concentrations of PFAS up to 35,000 parts per trillion. So it is out there. It is, getting into the waterways. And then Dublin Airport this year, obviously they will have firefighting foams and they'll have done training exercises as well. So they released a report in April 2024, and they've reported PFAS in their surface and groundwater as well as soil. So there's detections there that have been picked up by the Forever Pollution Project. The forever nature of these chemicals means that contamination events will persist, and there may be accumulation or transportation of the contaminants. So we do see that there are instances of PFAS contamination in this country. So the EU approach then, so EU are trying to regulate PFAS at drinking water levels. So at this point, the European Drinking Water Directive limits total PFAS in drinking water to 500 parts per trillion, and then concentrations for the sum of 20 individual, these are listed PFAS compounds, to 100 parts per trillion. So they've identified 20 to put on that list. So these concentrations are actually closer to where the US EPA were prior to 2016. So I think we can expect for drinking water EU regulations to follow suit and to come in line with those latest US EPA concentrations of single-digit PPT. And then the EU has also restricted the use of PFAS. So PFOS has been restricted since 2009. PFOA is now banned since 2020. And then there's a number of other compounds that have been restricted, but just a small number there that they've looked to restrict the use of these compounds completely. So that leads us to what exactly are we doing at the EU level? So now the European Chemicals Agency are looking at this, and what they are proposing is to restrict PFAS, restrict the use of PFAS. And the aim here is to address the manufacture, placing on the market, as well as the use of PFAS. So they're looking at the top of the supply chain, as opposed to the drinking water end of the chain. And they're proposing restrictions of PFAS based on an OECD definition. And this is any substance that contains at least one fully fluorinated metals, CF3, or methylene CF2 carbon atom. So this means that just one fluorinated carbon atom in your compound gets it onto that list. And this flowchart is from the OECD themselves, and it shows you what it covers. And it literally does cover pretty much all of PFAS. It even has others down here at the bottom. They've covered everything. And I've highlighted here, it does include the polymers. So PTFE and PVDF are just really widely used and well-known polymers and very, very useful. And they've fallen under this definition of PFAS for restriction from the European Chemicals Agency. Now, this is in consultation at the moment, and as part of their report, they do include derogations. So they recognise that there are essential uses for PFAS, and so this is an example of derogations that they've proposed for medical applications, so wound treatment products and tubes and catheters. So they're talking about a 12-year derogation to identify alternatives that can be used for those medical uses. So they do recognize that it is a quite broad, possibly heavy-handed approach, but that there are essential uses for PFAS, and they are aiming to reconcile those two problems. So the takeaway on the EU approach, so while they may aim to restrict the use of PFAS, the derogations, particularly for essential uses, means you can continue to use those PFAS materials in your processes. However, bear the Drinking Water Directive in mind. PFAS compounds must not end up in drinking water supplies. So you need to be mindful of what's coming out in your wastewater. And additionally, the Urban Wastewater Directive, so this is the recast directive, the text recently provisionally agreed, and they're looking at a polluter pays principle. So they are looking specifically at PFAS and the development of an extended producer responsibility system for products generating PFAS. So look, regulation is coming, it's moving quickly. There's a recognition now that PFAS are toxic compounds that need to be dealt with. And the EU approach has taken a drastically different approach to the US. But to compare those, they're opposite solutions to a very difficult challenge. So the US EPA are saying regulate a small number of compounds to very low concentration in drinking water, keep the population safe. European Chemicals Agency says, no, regulate all fluorinated compounds at the point of use, go to the top of the chain there. But there is a method to their madness. It is better to manage PFAS at its most concentrated point. And we'll get into that a little bit when we look at solutions. Okay, so we've had an overview of what PFAS are, what the problem is, but now how do we deal with them? So let's look at the solutions for people who are using PFAS in their processes and may have it in their wastewater. So the treatment options are you can either have removal of PFAS or destruction. So removal from the waste stream and then sent away for destruction elsewhere, or you can have on-site destruction, and there's technologies for both options. So we'll look at removal technology first, and this is the most common one, activated carbon. It's a very cheap and cheerful treatment for PFAS. So for this, the PFAS is absorbed to a carbon media, so it's a solid media that can then be sent away for destruction. It's pretty easy to use, but it's not great on short chain PFAS, so it's not going to cover all of those PFAS compounds. Next up is ion exchange. So this is similar to activated carbon in that it's an adsorbent technology. So the PFAS get absorbed to a solid IX resin, and that can then be sent for destruction. So it's a little bit more expensive, a little bit more energy intensity required, but then it hits a broader base of PFAS compounds. And then the next one is all singing, all dancing, reverse osmosis. So that'll get pretty much all of your PFAS. So it is more expensive. It has a higher energy use, but you do remove those PFAS compounds and then they will come out in a concentrated brine stream, and that can be quite useful for destruction technologies. And as I said, it covers a broader base of PFAS compounds. And then the final one I have on the list here, and this is not exhaustive, there are other technologies out there, but it's just to give you a flavor of the ways that this can be approached. So foam fractionation is it's similar to dissolved air flotation. So there's a gas that's bubbled through the water, and the PFAS then collect in the foam at the top. A little bit of energy use required, but it is cheap, but not great, again, on short chain PFAS. And then that foam is then taken away as a liquid media for destruction post-removal. So that's all of your, well, not a non-exhaustive list of removal technologies. So let's look at destruction. So you can have destruction on site. These are all at varying levels of maturity, and each will suit different types of wastewater. So it depends on the concentration of PFAS, the volume, it depends on what else is in the wastewater and the concentration of that. But all of these require high energy inputs to break that strong carbon-fluorine bond. So with electrochemical oxidation, these are electrodes with a potential difference across the electrodes, and that drives oxidation of PFAS compounds at the electrode surface. This is a relatively mature technology in other applications and now being used for PFAS. It does require expensive materials in terms of it can use boron-doped diamond electrodes. And of course, to break that carbon-fluorine bond, it will require high energy inputs. So an alternative then is supercritical water oxidation. So this is taking water above the supercritical point, which is temperatures above 374 degrees Celsius, pressure above 22 megapascals, so that's 220 times atmospheric pressure, So the water, oxygen, and PFAS are then all dissolved in a phase that is not quite a liquid, not quite a gas, and then you get very rapid mineralization of the PFAS compounds. But because of those high temperatures and pressures, you're talking about very high energy requirements. And because everything in the solution is mineralized, it does leave a scale behind that then has to be dealt with. So pros and cons to all of them. Advanced oxidation reduction processes. So these, again, are relatively mature technology already used elsewhere for the breakdown of other difficult to treat materials. So in these processes, it's generation of high energy reactive species like ozone, oxygen, hydroxyl radicals, or high energy electrons in the case of reduction. And it's these reactive species that cause the breakdown of PFAS chemical bonds. So these can be quite flexible solutions, but they do require that high energy input. Again, carbon-fluorine bond needs to be broken and a catalyst may need to be introduced there. And then plasma is, again, it's used to generate reactive species for the breakdown of PFAS compounds. Haven't seen it used an awful lot, to be honest. It claims relatively low energy input, but it's not good on the breakdown of short chain PFAS. So that's, again, a non-exhaustive list of the destruction technologies that are available and at various stages of maturity. And it does depend on the type of wastewater you have, the type of PFAS you have, and what other constraints are on site. So having discussed destruction, I want to go back to concentration for a moment and just look at those US EPA levels of 4 parts per trillion. So, and I want to give you a visual of what that actually means. So 4 parts per trillion is the equivalent of 1 teaspoon of sugar, and it's dissolved in not just 1 Olympic-sized swimming pools, but 400 Olympic-sized swimming pools. At 2-meter depth, I realize that might be controversial in an Olympics setting, but for the purposes of this visualization, it gives us a nice round number. So that is just such a low concentration. And when you're looking at destruction technologies and that huge amount of energy that you need to put in, and if you're looking at treating water that is close to those regulations, if those single digit parts per trillion, I mean, what you're doing is very expensively using expensive technology to essentially boil what is mostly water. Okay, so it's a really, really impractical use of destruction technology. So that's why I say the EU approach may be a bit more practical to move up the chain. And there's a solution to this. So the solution to dilution is concentration. So you can use those removal technologies, for example, reverse osmosis, to concentrate the PFAS in the waste stream so that you have a low volume, high concentration solution. And then you add in a destruction technology like electrochemical oxidation. And that is a much more cost-effective and energy-efficient way of dealing with these compounds. So let's just bear in mind this concentration gradient. The point of use, the point of manufacture is much more concentrated. By the time PFAS is diluted through the pipe network, an urban wastewater treatment plant, through surface waters, through a drinking water plant, to the final consumer, by the time you get to this point, it's really impractical, expensive to deal with PFAS, and the approach to target it at the point of use is just much, much more sensible. And then just a note on concentration and detection and monitoring. So these very low concentrations make detection very challenging. And in fact, it's not just the low concentrations, it's the thousands of compounds. So which do you target in an analysis? So analysis is expensive and time consuming. And of course, you're dealing with, depending on the wastewater, there'll be other compounds in there, and these can cause interferences as well. So that is why there is a reliance on presumptive contamination in the Forever Pollution Project, but investment in these services will see improvements in our detection. But it's just something to bear in mind that it's not easy to get the data on these compounds. Okay, so I've thrown a lot at you, and I realize it's a complex topic, but I hope that you have a better understanding of the issue of PFAS now, and you're probably wondering, what do I do next? But before you leave today, if you take nothing else away from this webinar, please take away these 3 key points. So the carbon-fluorine bond is key. It's the reason for the desirable properties in PFAS compounds, and it's also the reason they are so durable and so difficult to break down. The number and diversity of PFAS compounds complicates things. It makes it harder to decide what to regulate. It makes it harder for monitoring, etc., etc. But concentration is everything. Deal with PFAS at its most concentrated point. So what should you do? As a manufacturer, you should be PFAS prepared. So what you want to do is identify PFAS compounds in your supply chain or your processes. So if you are in one of these industries that we've identified, you may have PFAS in your supply chain. Be aware that regulations in the US, in the EU and Ireland are becoming more stringent and will become more stringent. But on the basis of the current EU definition that is in that proposal, I would assume all organic fluorinated compounds may be problematic for the moment. So then get in touch with us, contact IMR for a technology assessment. We can answer any questions you have about PFAS. We can look at how to deal with it. We can help set up a technology trial if that is suitable for your needs. And that is everything. So thank you all for listening.